Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sascha Fahrbach. Overnight rocket and drone strikes hit Kyiv, while investigators are probing deadly explosions in Lviv as a potential terrorist attack. At the same time, Slovakia has warned it could suspend emergency electricity supplies amid a dispute over the Druzhba pipeline, adding energy pressure to an already complex battlefield and diplomatic landscape. Now, to analyze it all, we're joined by David Kirichenko, Associate Research Fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. Welcome to TVP World. Good to have you.
Thank you for having me on.
David, I want to start with the latest here, the overnight rocket strikes in Kyiv and also what's happening in Lviv. What's your take on this? I mean, looking at Lviv first, the mayor has already called this a terrorist attack. How certain we are of that? What's your take on the latest there?
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if it was a terrorist attack. One thing that I've been tracking in recent months is the growing amount of people that are being recruited looking for easy money over Telegram. It's becoming a huge problem, one that's really hard to combat with these social networks and Russian intelligence identifying desperate people and using them to do bombings across Ukraine, which include children and teenagers that are told they can get easy money by carrying packages or bombs and delivering them to certain locations that were provided by the Russian intelligence. So we need to wait for further confirmation, but certainly worth highlighting that the use of people to conduct terrorist attacks in Ukraine is quite a common phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I mean, looking at location, just for context, Lviv, that's very much in the west of the country. Also location, I think, very key for a lot of supplies coming through weapons. That's proximity close to Poland, the European Union. Does this, let's say, make this more of a tempting target than other cities? Will we see something more here?
Certainly, I think the Russians certainly want to drive the idea that every part of Ukraine is under threat, and especially in the western regions and those regions that are a hub for Western supplies coming in, that the Russians are hoping to destabilize them and increase the terror threat there.
Mm-hmm. And then overall, we're looking at these strikes as well. We're hearing it's also across the country. I mean, not just the first ones from the overnight attacks, but just the last few days. What does this tell us? I mean, it may not be a surprise, but do you think that because we're marking that full-scale invasion, is Russia trying to send a signal here? Is this normal combat operations? How do we take these recent strikes?
Certainly, it's also just a sign of Russia's desperation. I think Western leaders, governments, they thought Ukraine would last for only a few days or weeks at the start of Russia's full-scale invasion. Putin's soldiers rolled into Kyiv wearing packing victory uniforms, thinking there would be a parade within a few weeks. And here we are, set to enter year 5 of a war, and the Russians are struggling to gain meters on the battlefield in Donbass, among other regions. So it's quite desperate for the Russians. And I think within the coming anniversary of the invasion, the Russians are going to try to flex and send more of these missiles across Ukraine to try and terrorize the population, hoping to break them. Putin's getting desperate, and he's going to continue taking more desperate measures to break the will of the Ukrainian people as his forces continue to rack up more and more casualties for very little gains.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and those very little gains, as you said, if we're looking at 4 years of this since the full-scale invasion, I mean, you could stretch this out and say, I mean, going back even further to what happened in Crimea, but let's look at these 4 years. 20% of Ukrainian territory, that's as much as Russia has claimed in these 4 years, but nevertheless, they continue the push, don't they? So I'm just wondering, I mean, this is the million-dollar question. Where do you see this play out? Is there a counteroffensive coming on either side? Are we closer to anything tangible negotiation-wise? What can we expect in the next few days ahead?
I mean, first, I'll provide my view, having been in the battlefield with Ukrainian units, embedded with Ukrainian drone operators. And just a few kilometers away from us, I'd sit there and watch these drone pilots bombing Russian soldiers that every few hours were crawling, walking, running through fields, just trying to infiltrate Ukrainian positions to make gains. And these soldiers are often very poorly equipped and older soldiers. And it just shows how desperate Russia is, throwing endless amounts of humans into these waves to die to show some sort of progress. Certainly, Ukraine has manpower challenges and it's making it difficult to plug in the gaps across the front line, but they are accounting for that and building more advanced trench and defensive networks across the front line, creating enhanced kill zones for the Russians to make it harder for the Russians to infiltrate. So I think we're going to see Ukrainian defensive lines increasingly stabilize and some localized counteroffensive operations like we see going on in southern Ukraine. And both sides are exhausted, and the Russians are increasingly taking aim at the political will of the West and hoping to break that down to further reduce support for Ukraine and exhaust the West. But if the West, especially Europe, maintains the political will and continues backing Ukraine, I think Putin will increasingly be forced to sit down as his economy is eating itself apart to sustain the war. And the Russians are struggling to recruit these soldiers for the meat grinder operation in Ukraine. And we could likely see both sides engage in more meaningful dialogue, which we are not currently seeing. The Russians are throwing a lot of theatrics, but time is also not on the Russian side.
Mm-hmm. Interesting you note there, as you said, you have been and seen and been entrenched there with Ukrainian units on the front. That's exactly building out those trenches, those fortified areas, looking at the east of the country and the Donbass. That's exactly the maximalist demand that Putin wants. It's exactly that territory that he wants, that he can't seem to get strategically. That's why he wants it so much. But at the same time, I'm curious about the mindset a little bit. Let's talk about the soldiers there. I mean, we've been following all this diplomacy, various summits from Geneva, trilaterals, etc. If you can tell us, what's the perception on the ground from the troops, from the soldiers, the officers, the people of Ukraine, as they continually hear about these talks? We're not really making much progress. How is that impacting morale on the front lines?
Of course, I think the Russians are weaponizing peace talks, and for people, soldiers on the front line, of course, they want peace. They want things to wrap up. They want to be able to go home. This is the war of the common person in Ukraine. They're not. Most of them are not, or your average soldier. They were just normal people who took up arms to defend themselves. And the Russians that are invading, many of them are criminals, rapists, thugs that have come to kill people for money. And so the Ukrainians are doing their part to defend their land against them, but giving them a false sense of hope and the hope that there could be a breakthrough in talks certainly gives hope to the Ukrainian soldiers. But throughout this past year, they've seen that it's a false start. They're not really making progress, and certainly things are difficult on the front line, especially with the use of all the glide bombs and weapon systems that the Russians are able to leverage. And the Ukrainians are doing the best that they can with the very limited weapons and systems that they have. And they hope that the West will see that negotiating without pressure on the Russians won't produce much. And they're doing their part on the battlefield to maximize the pressure on the Russians by killing as many Russians as possible.
Right. I'll ask you two more key things. One, we've recently had the mayor of Kyiv, Mr. Klitschko, on an interview for us at TVP World. Now, I want to read you what he said about the subject of wartime elections. He said, and warned that holding elections under martial law could be what he calls poison. So what do you think of that statement? Is there a realistic way forward for wartime elections right now?
Well, certainly during wartime, a lot of the political tension or animosities haven't really boiled over yet. And I think there's certainly a lot of factions that are ready to go at it with each other. We've had in the last few weeks, I think even from Ukraine's former commander-in-chief, General Zaluzhny, has been interesting to see some of the comments and information coming out from his camp. I think Poroshenko has been quite active in his feelings towards Zelensky. And even Zelensky's campaign against big mayors like Klitschko across the country. And I think there's a lot of positioning, political positioning across the country for upcoming elections that may be had. But of course, the Russians see the potential to use it to divide Ukrainians further. And they're certainly hoping for maximum destabilization within Ukraine. So there's risk and there is danger. But if it's needed, I think the Ukrainians will do their best to mitigate that risk and hold wartime elections or a referendum, if need be, to bring a just peace and a just end to the war.
All right. And also, speaking of energy, that's a key one, especially something that's come up very, very recently. We've just had very threatening words from Slovakian Prime Minister Robert Fico, who's essentially given Ukraine a deadline for Monday to restore the pipeline flow, the Druzhba pipeline, it's called. That's something that Slovakia wants and needs. But in terms threatening that they would suspend and turn off any kind of emergency electricity flow to Ukraine. So how do you see this play out, and how significant are those emergency electricity supplies to Ukraine right now?
Yeah, I believe, as the Slovakian premier himself said, that Ukraine in January alone more than doubled the import of Slovakian electricity, more or less. But to the broader point, Ukraine is in urgent need of electricity and energy supplies. And I think both Hungary and Slovakia can conveniently leave out that, at least in this case, it was Russian aggression, or as the Ukrainian authorities said, a Russian drone that hit the pipeline. Slovakia is accusing Ukraine of slow rolling the repairs of the pipeline. But ultimately, Ukraine will likely work to repairing the pipeline and getting the electricity, the oil flowing back to the Slovakians. But it also just serves as a lesson for the Slovakians, and that they have brought this dependence upon themselves, and the Russians are punishing it. The Russians are punishing the Slovakians for having this dependence on Russian oil. And hopefully it is a lesson for the Slovakians to pivot away from the Russians.
All right. So thanks for all that. We're going to close it there. Really appreciate all those insights. David Kirichenko, Associate Research Fellow, Henry Jackson Society. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. That concludes World Talks, but stay right here on TVP World for more news and commentary. Goodbye.